Welcome, class, to our first PowerPoint lecture for Chapter 1, which is an overview to understanding abnormal behavior. Hopefully, I think pretty much all of you at this point have taken a general psychology class, so you might be a little bit familiar with some of the material we're going to cover in this first chapter. And if not, that's okay. It's a great experience to learn some new things. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is starting to really form an idea of how we come to determine that somebody does have a psychological disorder. So when we think of abnormal psychology, we want to think about, what behaviors are abnormal. So taking a look at this list here and reading through it, and just ask yourself if you feel like any of these sort of stand out to you as things that you would find to be really abnormal or not. So the first one is if you find a lucky seat in an exam, or are unable to eat, sleep, or study for days after ending a relationship. Maybe breaking into cold sweat at the thought of being trapped in an elevator. Refusing to eat solid food for days to stay thin. Thorough hand washing after riding a bus. Believing government agents monitor your phone calls. Drinking a 6-pack of beer a day in order to be sociable. And if you're like a lot of people, probably some of these things sound more understandable than others. And so that's a good example of why it can be a little bit challenging to start to formulate what a real definition is and how we diagnose a psychological disorder. So the first thing that we look at here is that the abnormal behavior has to involve a disturbance of psychological function or behavior. Okay, so that means that it has to cause some kind of disturbance. If not, it's unlikely that it's an actual disorder. Also, the psychological dysfunction associated with distress or impairment that is not typical or culturally appropriate. So this is a really important thing to consider, I believe, throughout the entirety of our class, which is having a real awareness of cultural diversity, and that while one thing in one culture may be completely acceptable, in another culture it could not be acceptable at all. And that goes for behaviors as well. So I think that as we work through this, always keeping that in mind helps keep an objective viewpoint, and also helps steer clear of increasing stigma or stereotype about cultures or people's experiences within them. So here's a list of criteria for establishing that there is the presence of a psychological disorder. The first thing is that there has to be clinical significance. And what that means is that the behavior involves a degree of impairment that a clinician can observe. Okay? So, like for instance, going back to the example of somebody who needs to find that lucky seat to take the exam. If they obsessed on losing their lucky seat to the point of not even being able to take the exam, or having, some kind of visible meltdown about it, that's probably definitely a good signifier that there's clinical significance going on. Okay. Next we have distress, and that means that it has to be causing the person who's experiencing it some level of distress, okay? This might sound similar to clinical significance, but the idea of distress or disability is that it applies to how the individual feels or behaves beyond having a measurable effect that the clinician can observe. Okay, so this really refers to what's happening for the individual. What are they experiencing that might not be observable to a clinician or to somebody on the outside? Next, this behavior cannot be a socially expectable response. This means that you know, again, going back to just having that cultural filter on this and making sure that just because it looks one way to somebody from one culture, you know, maybe it's a socially expectable response in a different culture. Um, and also, there needs to be a psychological or biological disturbance. So, there needs to be some level of disturbance going on scientifically. And also, the behavior cannot be defined in terms of social rebellion or deviance, okay? So, let's look at what causes this sort of abnormal behavior now that we've got an idea of how the criteria that it takes to determine if there is one. What causes the abnormal behavior to happen? So what we're going to look at here is the biopsychosocial perspective, okay? And what this is a perspective that says that you take all of these factors and you combine them together, and that's what causes the abnormal behavior or the psychological distress, okay? So you'll see here we have psychological factors, including personality traits, coping ability, and perception. Biological factors, including genetics, biochemistry, and brain structure. And sociocultural factors, including experiences throughout life, family dynamics, and your environment. And then here you go. Here's the perfect storm, if you will, of all of these three coming together into a combination that creates these abnormal behaviors. So looking more at each one of these things, when we talk about biological contributions, this would be obviously biology, so factors within the body that contribute to abnormal behavior. And these include genetic abnormalities that alone or in combination with the environment influences psychological functioning. So the most relevant genetic influences for when we're talking about abnormal behavior and abnormal psychology, these are factors that alter the functioning of the nervous system. Also interesting to keep in mind about biology when you're thinking about people who have certain physical ailments like thyroid disturbances or you know, traumatic brain injury. Those are strictly biological changes that are happening in someone's body, and they definitely can produce some abnormal behavior and some fluctuation in mood and mood disturbance, okay? The next we have is the psychological. So the psychological contributions include past learning experiences, maladaptive thought patterns, and difficulties coping with stress. This can really also refer back to environment and learning. So past learning experiences doesn't necessarily just mean learning in school, right? This also means past learning experiences like being brought up by your parents and learning how they cope with things and how they teach you the proper way to deal with things. And then we have the sociocultural contribution and perspective. The sociocultural perspective refers to various circles of influence on the individual, ranging from close friends and family to the institutions and policies of a country or the world as a whole. So these interact in important ways with biological processes afflicting the brain and with psychological contributions that occur through exposure to particular experiences. A really important part of sociocultural contributions to abnormal behavior to keep in mind is discrimination. Discrimination not only limits people's ability to experience psychological well-being, but can also have direct effects on physical health and development. For example, it has long been known that people from lower economic income and status brackets are more likely to have a psychological disorder due to the constant strain of being discriminated against, as well as lack of access to education and health resources. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind, as well as coming back to starting to talk a little bit more about the stigma of mental illness and sort of these abnormal psychologies that we're going to be studying. The stigma of psychological disorders affects people from across different ethnic, oops, sorry about that, guys. Different racial and ethnic backgrounds, absolutely. However, in studies, we've seen that European American adolescents and their caregivers are twice as likely as members of minority groups to define problems in mental health terms or to seek help for such problems. So going back to what we were just talking about discrimination, lack of resources, lack of access to care, all of those things can make that stigma even more intense for people who are facing the stigma on top of the discrimination. So as we were just talking about, this, as all three of these things culminate, this is the biopsychosocial perspective. So this is saying that all of these things come together and influence the development of the individual. Okay, so now we're going to take a little bit more of an in-depth look at abnormal psychology throughout history and specifically gather some more information about really the history also of the stigma about mental illness and how that has come to pass throughout history, as well as progress we've made and areas in which we still need to be really thinking about how to make care for people with mental illness more accessible and also better. So, we're going to talk about first the scientific approach. So starting with Hippocrates, who I don't know if you remember him from learning about Greek history and learning about the history of the scientific method, but he's sort of considered the founder of modern medicine. So he believed that there are 4 important bodily fluids influenced physical and mental health, okay? And that these 4 important bodily fluids then led to 4 personality dispositions. Therefore, he thought that in order to treat a psychological disorder, you would just need to rid the body of excess fluid. Obviously, this is not correct, but what Hippocrates did is he did start to consider that there might be a scientific approach to treatment of mental illness. Next we have Claudius Galen, who is a Roman physician, and he developed a system of medical knowledge based on anatomical studies. Then we have Benjamin Rush, and Benjamin Rush is considered the founder of American psychiatry, and he was greatly affected and appalled by the poor treatment of the psychologically disturbed patients in the Pennsylvania hospital in 1783. He really advocated for improvements, such as placing patients in their own wards, giving them occupational therapy, and prohibiting hospital visits from curiosity seekers looking for entertainment. He also supported the use of bleeding people and purging in the treatment of psychological disorders, as well as was a proponent of the tranquilizer chair, which was intended to reduce blood flow to the brain by binding the patient's head and limbs. He also recommended submerging patients in cold shower baths and frightening them with death threats, because he believed that if he could frighten them enough, maybe they would snap out of it and be able to control their violent behavior that was clearly caused by their mental disorder. Oh, and here we go. Here are some more details about each of those men that we just went through, those scientists, and how they impacted using the scientific approach. From there, looking forward even more into the next sort of wave of scientists and those who were trying to find different ways to treat psychological disorders. Sigmund Freud, who, again, if you took general psychology, you remember learning a little bit about Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. And he really, psychoanalysis is really focused on this idea of accessing the unconscious mind and also inhibited sexual impulses throughout development and in early development. Pavlov, you've probably heard of Pavlov's dog. That's known as classical conditioning. B.F. Skinner, who is the man responsible for formulating operant conditioning, and then using operant conditioning to modify behavior. And then really what we're looking at now when we're talking about the most recent transition into how we're thinking about treating mental illness, we're really in a wave of positive psychology, which emphasizes the potential for growth and change throughout life. It views psychological disorders as difficulties that inhibit the individual's ability to achieve highly subjective well-being and feelings of fulfillment. Also really emphasizes prevention as the best way to treat instead of the more reactive treatment. So those are sort of the things that when we talk about how we've, what we've come to and how these psychological disorders have begun to really be viewed from the scientific approach. Now, stepping back, the way that it began, and really, like I was saying before about the stigma, when we're thinking about how those stigmas against mental illness really developed, we need to really take a look at the spiritual approach. So the spiritual approach regarded psychological disorders as the product of possession by evil or demonic spirits. Treatments included tree finding, exorcism, and treatments recommended by the church. Okay, so again, this would be starting in 8000 BC, for instance. This was how people started to think of mental illness and started to have a real fear of it, which I believe is still, unfortunately, present in our world today, that there is some of this leftover fear about mental illness and those who struggle with it. So looking at these treatments a little bit, tree finding, this was a process in which a hole had been cut in people's skulls. And it's believed that the reason that the holes were cut into the people's skulls was so that the evil spirits would be able to leave their head. Archaeologists have found skulls with this sort of treatment ranging from the Far and Middle East to Britain and South America. And then we're going to look at exorcism. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the movie The Exorcist. So, of course, this is also believing that the mental disturbance is caused by a spirit or a demon inhabiting the body, and that the evil spirits need to be driven away. A shaman, priest, or medicine man carries out rituals that put the individual under extreme physical and mental duress. During the Middle Ages, this also, exorcism, and looking back to the Middle Ages, this is really where we start to think about mentally ill people being accused of witchcraft or personifications of the devil. Because of these terms, these people were punished severely because they were thought to be possessed by evil spirits and were depicted as heretics and devils that the church had to destroy in order to preserve Christianity. Of course, then we all know what happens and how that progresses starting in the 1500s and continuing up until the late 1600s. We saw a lot of burning and hanging of women who were accused of witchcraft, and that leading up to the Salem witchcraft trials, which is where everybody finally started to doubt that. So this isn't really still the prevalent view in Western culture, but there are still pockets of believers in modern society that these types of things are really the cause of the abnormal behavior that those who are afflicted with mental illness tend to display. So next we're going to talk about the humanitarian approach. This came about as a reaction against the spiritual approach and its associated punishment of people with psychological disorders. It regarded psychological disorders as the result of cruelty, stress, or poor living conditions. So we're going to look at different aspects of this humanitarian approach. By the end of the 18th century, throughout hospitals in France, Scotland, and England, a few courageous people began to recognize the inhumanity of the conditions in the poorhouses. They initiated sweeping reforms in an attempt to reverse these harsh practices, and this is where the idea of moral treatment took hold, which is the notion that people could develop self-control over their behaviors if they had a quiet and restful environment. Imagine that. If they weren't being stressed out and tortured, they might be able to learn how to better control their behaviors. I want to mention the timeline here. So that starts to happen in the early 1800s. There's a lot of overcrowding, and because of the overcrowding, a little bit back to resorting to that physical punishment to try to control the patients there by the staff. So in 1841, we have Dorothea Dix, who comes in and takes up the cause of reform. She's horrified by the inhumane conditions that she sees and appeals to the Massachusetts legislature for more state-funded public hospitals to provide humane treatment. She also spread this message throughout Europe and North America. And because of that, really over the next 100 years, governments built a lot of state hospitals throughout the states in the model that she proposed in that humanitarian model. Unfortunately, only a matter of time before these new hospitals are overcrowded and understaffed. And partly because some of the treatments, although very well-meaning and coming from a really good place, were also ineffective. So instead of really trying to work with people to figure out how to really treat their conditions, their mental illness, they're just sort of being housed in these safe places. Unfortunately, more and more and more people enter into the hospitals, and they all become overcrowded. Into the 20th century, we have the mental hygiene movement, and this reflects the goal of helping individuals maintain mental health and prevent the development of psychological disorders. Okay. So as all the hospitals are continuing to be overcrowded and resorting back to that physical punishment, there's now more and more public outrage over the situation in mental hospitals, and this finally leads to a more widespread realization that mental health services require dramatic changes. So in 1963, the federal government passed the Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Center Construction Act, and initiated a series of changes that would affect mental health services. So legislatures began to promote policies designed to move people out of institutions and into less restrictive programs in the community. For example, vocational rehabilitation facilities, day hospitals, and psychiatric clinics. So after their discharge from the hospital, people would enter halfway houses, which is a rehabilitation-oriented group living home, and they provide supportive environments to support people learning how to essentially live day to day. Also in the 1950s, and part of why this deinstitutionalization was allowed to happen or was able to take place was because there were some pharmacological treatments for the first time in history that could successfully control symptoms of psychological disorders. So this really helped and improved people's ability to live for years to come outside of institutions. Jumping ahead there. By the mid-1970s, we're back to the problem of overflowing, and I'm sorry, not overflowing, the opposite. These because people have been moving out because of all the efforts to get them into halfway houses and the pharmacological interventions and people becoming more functional, the mental hospitals are pretty well deserted. So these hospitals had also freed a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of institutionally confined people, and this was the deinstitutionalization movement. Although this came from, again, a very well-meaning place, it's unfortunately had a little bit of backlash in that today there is not enough funding to get everybody into halfway houses and into good programs that can help them move forward. And it also leaves people who do have really prevalent long-term serious mental illness in a little bit of a pitfall, because some people won't be rehabilitated to the point of being able to live functionally on their own. And these are the people that we've sort of left hanging without too much of a plan. These are a lot of the people that you see living on the streets, or you'll see these people going back and forth in and out of the hospital constantly throughout their lives. Also really falling into issues with substance use disorders and that kind of thing, because they really are not capable of reaching a point of being independently functional. So that is still something that is needing to be looked at and worked on in order to make sure that those people have resources and are cared for. All right, let's talk a little bit about research methods in abnormal psychology. So again, going back to this idea of the scientific method, and remembering that the essence of the scientific method is objectivity, which is the process of testing ideas about the nature of psychological phenomenon without bias before accepting these ideas as adequate explanations. So this means that going into a psychological experiment to prove a phenomena with the idea in your head that you already know it's going to end up one way or the other does not work very well, because your research will frequently be pulled in that direction. So the scientific method helps people remain objective and helps really create that objectivity in experiments so that we have valid research. So here we have a scientific method. Again, just that objectivity is incredibly important, and that is the ideal approach to all scientific method and experimentation. So we have the experimental design here. So first we have the independent variable. The independent variable is the variable that the investigator manipulates. So the investigator sets up at least two conditions that reflect different levels of the independent variable. In most cases, these conditions are the experimental or treatment group, which is the group that receives the treatment, and the control group, which is the group that receives no treatment or a different treatment. Okay? Researchers then compare the groups on the dependent variable, which is the variable that they observe. So here's an example. A researcher may wish to investigate the efficacy of group therapy to reduce the symptoms of a type of anxiety. The independent variable would be the provision of therapy versus control. The dependent variable, measured before and after the independent variable was manipulated, would be the number of anxiety symptoms. Okay? There are some things that can never be truly independent variables because the investigator is not able to manipulate it. An example of that would be somebody's depression. Okay, that can't be easily manipulated by the investigator. Also, investigators cannot randomly assign people to groups based on their biological sex, okay? And studies that investigate differences among groups not determined by random assignment are known as quasi-experimental. So that means that they haven't been truly randomized, okay? A placebo condition is one in which participants receive a treatment similar to the experimental treatment, but one that lacks the key feature of the treatment of interest. So I'm sure that you've all heard of things like people being given sugar pills that look just like the medication. So that's a placebo condition to see. That's a good way to test, is it actually the medication that's working, or is it the belief that the medication is working, okay? And then we have a double blind, which, and I'm sorry guys, I'm trying to keep up with the book and this PowerPoint, and it's a little different. It's not going all at the same time. Okay, then we have the double blind. So let's talk about this a little bit. So expectations about the experiment's outcome can affect both the investigator and the participant, okay? These so-called demand characteristics can compromise the conclusions about the intervention's true effectiveness. Obviously, the investigator should be as unbiased as possible, but there still may be subtle ways that he or she communicates cues that affect the participant's response. Once that happens, the experiment is no good, right? Because you can't tell if that's their real reaction or because they've gotten that signal from the investigator. So the best way to eliminate demand characteristics is to use a double-blind method. And a double-blind method is one which shields both investigator and participant from knowing either the study's purpose or the nature of the patient's treatment, okay? Next we have a correlational design. So this correlate, right, the word correlate, tests relationships between two variables that researchers cannot experimentally manipulate. The correlational statistic is expressed in terms of a number between a positive 1 and a negative 1. Positive numbers represent positive correlations, meaning that as scores on one variable increase, scores on the second variable increase as well. So here's an example. Because one aspect of depression is that it causes a disturbance in normal sleep patterns, you would expect then that scores on a measure of depression would be positively correlated with scores on a measure of sleep disturbances. So more depression, more sleep disturbances. Conversely, negative correlations indicate that as scores on one of the variables increase, scores on the second variable decrease. An example of a negative correlation is the relationship between depression and self-esteem. So you'll see the positive go up on the more depressed, right? The higher depression, the lower the self-esteem. So that's a negative correlation, okay? Because they would both be going the same way in a positive correlation, all right? Really important to remember with correlation studies is that it doesn't determine causality. So just because sleep disturbances and depression have a positive correlation, it doesn't mean that sleep disturbances cause depression. Okay, that's where you have to keep that in mind. Just because they correlate doesn't mean that one caused the other. Okay, types of research studies. First, we have, here we go, a survey. So a survey is to obtain population data. So this would be researchers working for a government agency attempt to determine disease prevalence through questionnaires administered over the telephone, okay? Then we have a laboratory study, which would be if one needed to collect data under controlled conditions. For example, an experiment conducted to compare reaction times to neutral and fear-provoking stimuli. Then we have a case study, which is an individual or a small group of individuals studied intensively. And a good example would be a therapist describes the cases of members of a family who share the same unusual disorder, or it would be like what you read in the beginning of this chapter in your book. There's a little case study of a client. Then we have a single case experimental design, which is the same person serves as subject in experimental and control conditions. An example, researchers report on the frequency of a client's behavior while the client is given attention, experimental treatment, and ignored, controlled condition, for aggressive outbursts in a psychiatric ward. And then behavioral genetics, attempt to identify genetic patterns in inheritance of particular behaviors. So an example, genetic researchers compare the DNA of people with and without symptoms of particular psychological disorders. Another good example of a survey, let's go back to the top there. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the U.S. government conducts yearly surveys to establish the frequency of use of illegal substances within the population. Okay. The incidence of a disorder is in the survey. Okay, you have the incidence and the prevalence. The incidence of a disorder is the frequency of new cases of a disorder within a given time period. And the prevalence of a disorder refers to the number of people who have ever had the disorder over a specified period of time. Okay. Laboratory study, pretty straightforward, I think. We can all agree that that's just carrying out experiments in a psychological laboratory. Case study we talked about. One thing to keep in mind about a case study is that it does not involve the types of experimental control or sample size that would deem it a useful addition to the literature. So investigators who use case studies must be extremely precise in their methods and take an objective and unbiased approach, right? Then we have the single case experimental design, which I think also pretty self-explanatory, which is just the one person. So instead of having that group or having more than one people, you're just going to be doing that experiment on that one person and using the control and experimental treatments. Behavioral genetics. Also, this is really where we're thinking about twin studies and adoption studies. So also another example of this would be getting a family history to find out to calculate the concordance rate or agreement ratio between people diagnosed as having the disorder and their relatives. So this would be expressed as in an example, a researcher may observe that 6 out of a sample of 10 twin pairs have the same diagnosed psychological disorder, and this would be a concordance rate of 0.6, which is 6 out of 10, okay? Adoption studies are really intriguing, and we have, in the first type, researchers can establish the rates of the disorder in children whose biological parents have diagnosed psychological disorders, but whose adoptive parents do not. So that's a really clear differentiation between the biology and the environment in which they were raised. And if they do have the same disorder as their parents, that really does signify a strong genetic factor. There's also another type of adoption study referred to as cross-fostering, and this is one in which researchers examine the frequency of the disorder in children whose biological parents had no disorder, but whose adoptive parents do. So if the children and their adoptive parents share the disorder, but not the biological parent, this suggests that the environmental factors have contributed significantly. It's important to remember with twin and adoption studies that there are some important weaknesses and so therefore cannot be conclusive. For example, in an adoption study, there may be unmeasured characteristics of the adoptive parents that influence the development of the disorder. Also, monozygotic twins do not share the same amniotic sac during prenatal development, so that can really change things. And they also may not even share 100% of the same DNA, so are not truly identical. Okay, so I think that's pretty much what we needed to cover in this chapter. There's a website there that you can check out for some more information. And again, going back to, I did cover a lot of what is already in the reading. I'm sorry, I already covered a lot of what is in the reading in this lecture. But I really encourage you to go ahead and read the chapter for yourself, because there might be some things in there that you find really interesting that I didn't touch on. All right, class, thanks a lot, and until next week.